Keeping up with environmental news these days, it's like drinking from a fire hose, right?
It really is. Every day brings a torrent of updates, reports, and policy changes.
So to help us all make sense of it all, today's deep dive is zeroing in on the most important recent developments. The ones that will actually have a lasting impact on climate and the environment.
Exactly. We've sifted through a mountain of news articles, scientific studies, even some organizational statements to bring you the essential updates. We're going to focus on a few key areas, the pretty dramatic shifts we're seeing in U.S. environmental policy, some significant global climate initiatives, and, the increasingly evident impacts of extreme weather events, unfortunately.
Basically, we're cutting through the noise to give you a clear understanding of what's really important without making your head spin.
Precisely.
So let's dive right in. First up, big changes on the horizon for environmental policy right here in the U.S.
Yeah, a lot happening. One of the biggest stories is the potential shakeup at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Both the Daily Climate and the New York Times are reporting on a plan that, well, it seems to aim at dismantling the EPA's Office of Research and Development.
And when you say dismantling, they're talking about potentially laying off over 1,000 scientists, right?
Yeah, that's the number being thrown around. That could represent, get this, up to 75% of the office's workforce. Pretty drastic.
I mean, that's a huge blow to independent research,
Yeah.
Think about it. The impact on pollution studies, climate change research.
Absolutely. It raises serious questions about the direction evidence-based policy is going to take, right?
Definitely. And Representative Zoe Lofgren, she actually put it really well. She said, and I'm quoting here, "Every decision the EPA makes must be in furtherance of protecting human health and the environment. And that just can't happen if you gut EPA science." I mean, she's not wrong.
No, she's got a point. This isn't just about abstract research. It's about the very foundation of environmental protection.
And these proposed changes, they're not just at the federal level either. The LA Times is reporting that California, a state usually known for being pretty progressive on environmental issues, is getting its own dose of change.
Right. So California's got this new Department of Government Efficiency, and get this, it's headed up by Elon Musk.
Interesting.
And they're proposing to close almost 24 environmental offices across the state.
Wow. Which agencies are we talking about?
Well, the list is pretty long. NOAA, EPA, National Park Service, the Forest Service, USGS, and probably more.
It's like they're hitting all the major players?
Yeah, pretty much. And the Daily Climate, they're reporting that part of this plan includes terminating 793 federal leases, which they say will save around $500 million.
So it's all about streamlining, right?
That's the argument. But of course, there's going to be a real impact on environmental work in California, monitoring, research, conservation, the whole shebang.
Yeah, I mean, efficiency is great, but not at the cost of our environment, right?
Right. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look at what's happening on the international scene. There's been, a noticeable pause in the Columbia River Treaty talks with Canada. This has been reported by both the Daily Climate and the Narwhal.
Now, for folks who don't know, this treaty, it's been around for decades and governs some pretty important things. Flood control, hydroelectric power generation, and water usage for both countries.
It's a pretty big deal, and this halt in the talks, well, it injects a lot of uncertainty into a system that's been in place for a long time.
Right.
How are we going to manage this shared resource going forward, especially with climate change making things more complex?
And it sounds like there's some pretty significant disagreements about the treaty terms.
Well, from what we're hearing, the view is that the current treaty isn't exactly fair to the U.S. And, this is just one example of how international environmental cooperation is becoming more challenging, especially as the stakes get higher with climate change.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to another big topic. Regulations, specifically those around chemical safety. We're seeing some interesting developments there, to say the least.
Definitely interesting. Both the Daily Climate and The Hill are reporting on the EPA's steps to, well, essentially weaken existing rules on chemical safety. This seems to kind of contradict some promises that were made earlier, but that's the current situation.
And I understand this isn't just about paperwork, right? I mean, these changes have very real implications for public health.
Oh, absolutely. For example, there was a lawsuit against a company that's emitting a probable carcinogen, and the EPA decided to drop it. And then there are plans to make screenings for really dangerous chemicals, like vinyl chloride less strict.
So basically less protection for people from harmful chemicals.
Basically, yeah. And, there are experts who are speaking out against this. Eve Gartner from Earth Justice, she points out that previous regulations actually led to some pretty significant health benefits, like a decrease in certain cancer risks.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. So rolling back those regulations could mean an increase in health problems, right?
Especially for vulnerable populations like children. Yeah, that's a real concern.
It's kind of a big deal, weakening those protections. And, it's not just environmental groups who are raising concerns. Former EPA Administrator Christine Todd Whitman, she's been pretty vocal about this, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she's been featured in both The Daily Climate and Living on Earth, talking about how these budget cuts and this whole deregulation push are really undermining the EPA's ability to do its job, to protect public health and respond effectively to disasters.
She's in a position to know, having been at the helm of the agency.
Exactly. And her warnings, they go beyond just environmental concerns. She even said, and this is a quote, that our democracy is teetering because of all this. So she's suggesting that this has implications for the whole system of governance.
That's a pretty powerful statement. Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about clean energy. The Trump administration's efforts to roll back some of the initiatives in that area, well, it's causing quite a stir.
Yeah, no kidding. It's creating uncertainty and, well, a lot of concern, even among U.S. manufacturers who are counting on those tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right, because they were planning to invest in clean energy projects.
Exactly. And now the Daily Climate and E&E News are reporting that nearly $8 billion worth of those projects, ones that were slated for 2025, they've been canceled because of this whole back and forth.
So it's actually hurting the economy.
It is. It's slowing down investment and creating this whole, chilling effect. Tim Fisher, he's with the American Sustainable Business Council, and he said, and this is a quote again, that this is causing delays and attracting much-needed investment. I mean, it's making it harder to transition to a cleaner energy system.
Okay, so we've got federal policy shifts, impacts on clean energy investment. What about California? They've always been kind of a leader in setting environmental standards.
Well, they're definitely in the spotlight. Climate Change Dispatch is reporting that Trump is specifically targeting California's EV mandate.
Right, that mandate that requires a certain percentage of new car sales to be electric vehicles.
Yep, that's the one. But there might be some good news for California. Apparently, there's a GAO report that, it basically gives some support to the EPA waiver that Biden approved, which could protect the mandate.
Okay, so a bit of a legal shield for California there. But it sounds like it's still a battleground. The Daily Climate and The Hill, they're talking about how California regulators are pushing back against car dealers who are campaigning against the state's emissions rules.
Yeah, it's like a tug of war.
Yeah.
The chair of the California Air Resources Board, Leanne M. Randolph, she called the car dealers' campaign a misleading attempt to create an artificial crisis. So, they're not backing down. They're committed to their environmental goals.
Seems like no one's giving an inch on this one.
That's the impression I get. And the thing is, California's actions, they have ripple effects across the country, so it's a really important fight to watch.
Absolutely. Okay, so in addition to all of this, we have even more policy reversals. Climate Change Dispatch is reporting that the Trump administration has rescinded 19 executive actions that were put in place during the Biden administration. These cover climate, regulations, you name it.
Wow, 19. That's a pretty clear signal, isn't it? They're really trying to undo a lot of what the previous administration put in place.
Yeah, definitely a change in direction.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's still a lot of uncertainty about what will happen to some specific environmental projects. LA Times is reporting on the uncertain fate of two new monuments in California, the Chuckwalla National Monument and the Satitla Highlands National Monument.
Yeah, and that uncertainty, it can trickle down and affect how those areas are managed, how resources are protected, the whole thing. It's not just about the big picture policies, it's about the practical, on-the-ground effects.
And then there are the financial repercussions of all these policy changes. The LA Times has a story about a Pasadena-based company called Tetra Tech. They do environmental and development work, and their stock price has taken a hit because of cuts to U.S. aid funding.
That's a real-world example of how these shifts in priorities can have a direct impact on businesses, especially those involved in environmental work. And remember, Tetra Tech, They were awarded billions of dollars in contracts just last year.
Yeah, so these cuts aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They affect real companies and real people's livelihoods.
Right, exactly. And to round out this whirlwind tour of U.S. policy news, the New York Times is reporting on a lawsuit that's been filed against the EPA by a group of nonprofit organizations. They're trying to access $20 billion in climate grants that Congress had already approved.
So even though the money's there, there's a battle over how it's going to be used.
It's complicated. This whole thing just underscores how messy and contentious implementing climate-related funding can be.
No kidding. Okay, so that's a lot to digest just on the U.S. front. Let's zoom out a bit and look at the global response to all of this. It's interesting to see how other countries are reacting to these shifts in U.S. policy.
It is. One of the most notable developments is that the UK is, well, they're taking a proactive stance. The Daily Climate and The Guardian are both reporting that they're working on forming a climate alliance with China and a bunch of developing nations.
So they're stepping up to fill the gap left by the U.S.
It seems like it. Ed Miliband, he's a prominent UK politician, and he's been holding talks in Beijing. He said, and I quote, "All major emitters need to act." So they're basically saying, look, we're not waiting for the U.S. to get its act together, we're moving forward.
I mean, it's encouraging to see that kind of leadership, right?
Absolutely. It shows that global climate action isn't completely stalled.
Okay, so we've got the big players like the UK and China, but what about the smaller, more vulnerable countries? How are they responding to all of this?
Well, Climate Home News has a really interesting report on this. Apparently, a bunch of what they call forgotten, fragile states are banding together and planning to really push for climate finance at the next big UN climate summit, COP30. They're urging Brazil, which is hosting the summit, to make their needs a priority.
And these are the countries that are often hit hardest by climate change, right?
Exactly. They often lack the resources to adapt to the impacts of climate change, so getting that financial support is crucial for them.
Yeah, it's a matter of survival for them. Okay, so we've talked about the policy shifts and the global response, but let's get real for a second. What are we seeing on the ground? What's actually happening because of climate change?
Well, unfortunately, we're seeing the impacts more and more every day. One striking example, a recent NASA-led study, it found that global sea levels rose 35% faster than expected last year. And this is largely because of record high temperatures, which caused the water to expand.
That's a pretty scary statistic. I mean, 35% faster than predicted.
It's a big jump. And Josh Willis, he's a scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, he put it this way: the rate of global rise is telling us something about what to expect at most coastlines around the world. So coastal communities, they really need to prepare for faster sea level rise than we previously thought.
Yeah, we can't just bury our heads in the sand on this one. We need to take action.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking action, or rather not taking action, there's some disturbing news about the Mauna Loa Observatory. This is the observatory in Hawaii that's been tracking atmospheric CO2 levels for decades, providing us with, invaluable data.
Right, it's like the gold standard for CO2 measurements.
Exactly. But the Daily Climate and the New York Times are reporting that the office that manages the observatory might actually be shut down because of budget cuts.
What? That's crazy. I mean, that data is crucial for understanding climate change.
I know, it's insane. Ralph Keeling, he's a scientist who works with the observatory, said, these data are our eyes on the planet. Losing that would be a huge setback for climate science.
It's like we're choosing to be blind to what's happening.
It feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? And it's not just monitoring that's at risk. The Daily Climate and the Associated Press, they're reporting on workforce reductions at federal agencies that manage dams.
Dams. How does that relate to climate change?
Well, think about it. Dams are critical for things like hydropower generation, water supply, flood control, all things that are going to be affected by climate change.
Right, so having fewer people to operate and maintain those dams could be a problem.
That's what the experts are saying. Lori Spraggins, she's with the Association of Dam Safety Officials, and she warned that without these dam operators, engineers, there is a serious potential for heightened risk to public safety and economic or environmental damage.
So basically, these cuts could make communities more vulnerable to climate impacts.
Exactly. And the same goes for our ability to respond to disasters. The Daily Climate and the New Yorker have been reporting on job cuts within the U.S. Forest Service, which is already stretched thin trying to deal with wildfires and other disasters.
I mean, we've seen the devastating wildfires in recent years. How can they cut back on resources when those fires are becoming more frequent and more intense.
It's a recipe for disaster, really. Haley Pines, she used to work for the Forest Service, and she described the impact of these cuts on her community as gutting. It's not just about losing jobs, it's about losing the capacity to protect communities and manage our natural resources.
It's heartbreaking, really. And then on top of all of this, we have the extreme weather events that are happening right now. Inside Climate News and Yale Climate Connections, they're reporting that severe weather warnings are still in effect after a weekend of tornadoes, dust storms, and fires.
Yeah, the National Weather Service issued over 250 tornado warnings just recently. It's a stark reminder that these events are becoming more frequent and more severe.
And it's the anniversary of the tri-state tornado, the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. The LA Times had an article about it, reminding us of just how destructive these events can be.
It's a sobering reminder. That tornado, it killed almost 700 people and injured over 2,000 back in 1925.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
We're still seeing that kind of destructive power today. Remember the dusty inferno that hit Oklahoma?
Yeah, NASA's Earth Observatory had some incredible images of that, the wildfires and dust storms raging side by side. It's a pretty clear illustration of the interconnected nature of these extreme events.
It's terrifying. And inside Climate News, they had a story about a well-known meteorologist in Alabama. He's actually pleading with people to support the National Weather Service after a series of deadly storms and tornadoes in his state.
Yeah, and Yale Climate Connections, they're highlighting the need for more support for disaster survivors who don't speak English well. I mean, these disasters, they affect everyone, and we need to make sure that everyone has access to help regardless of language barriers.
So it's not just about predicting and responding to these events, it's also about taking care of people in the aftermath.
Absolutely. And finally, here's a bit of a curveball, a news item that, well, it really caught my attention. NPR is reporting on a new study that suggests that being exposed to heat, like extreme heat, can actually age you faster, similar to how smoking does.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Apparently, it can alter your DNA and potentially lead to all sorts of long-term health problems. So it's another reminder that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a public health issue, too.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So that's our deep dive into the latest climate and environmental news for today.
We covered a lot of ground, didn't we? From those major proposed changes in U.S. environmental policy to the global community's response, and of course, the increasingly apparent impacts of extreme weather.
Hopefully, we've given you a clear and concise overview of what's happening and what it all means.
Yeah, because we know it's a fire hose of information out there, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a question to ponder. With all of these rapid changes in policy, the growing intensity of climate impacts, the global response, what does it all mean for the future, for our planet, for our communities? It's something to really think about.
And how can we, as individuals and as a society, navigate these complex challenges and, do our part to protect our environment and ensure a healthy future?
We encourage you to keep learning, keep engaging, and keep the conversation going.
And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into the most important news shaping our world.